On the sustain and its relations, third part. Well, I was saying appoggio, pronunciation, and everything that can put down. Also the rib cage can put down. It's one of its works. It does. In opposition with sustain. Sustain is by itself. And it is tricky because it is the proper diaphragm. So when it works, we don't perceive it. When we start, it is the weak part. You can imagine that why Italian bel canto technique is so renowned and so justificately renowned, sorry for my English. It's because it is a system in which the sustain comes first, always. Comes first means that you will always have a sustain under a sound. Doesn't matter if Lily Lemon, you put the sustain on the sound. Lily Lemon was a very renowned teacher and singer of 19th century, and we are so lucky that we have some recordings of the first years of don't remember, it was something like 1902, 1907. We've got some recordings of those years. She was a bit not totally young. She was born in 1848, and you can understand why she was so renowned and why it's so important to read her essay, her treatise and her method. And she is also a representative of bel canto technique, yes, of course. And she uses to talk about the breathing in a different way as I do, because simply she uses in her style to put the sustain on the note. You can put the sustain on the note, or you can put the sustain before the note. You can put the sustain before the note and then attacking the sound with the appoggio. It is what, when we do really well, David Jones we do. We always have a sustain in opposition. Without a sustain, we can't sing, simply because there will be no pressure under, there will be nothing. And if you try and you strain your vocal folds, and they get in an abductory deficit immediately. So, and it is the condition in which sometimes they arrive to me. They're just there without sound. And it is, no, we don't look for the sound for a little. We just put some sustain. And then you go on with that. That was what I was doing with Alice Robert. That was why I wanted her to do with her gestures. Because I don't want to change her attack. I want to change the point of starting of her attack. And I wanted to put also that there. So her brain will not just do that to sing. And she reaches where they are. And where the pressure is, and where the larynx is. Basically, without knowing why they're there. Or because the life has put her larynx, her positions there, or because she didn't study that. So you push and you push and you push and you push and you push. The position is not good enough, and then you've got, your larynx can't sing because it can't sing here and it can't sing there. We have a segment of movement in which is physiological and correct. In the bridges, we are quite forced to do something, and imagine what we do with the sustain, of course. That's why when you use not well the sustain and you don't work proper on the sustain, you have the holes, the first holes that tells you that something is wrong. They're always in the passage of register that are not one note. They're not a point in between two notes. They're segments. That's why we call them bridges, because we have to really build them on the sustain, and they are the weakest points of a voice. And it is where we see and we hear that if you have a good ear and a good technique, you will perceive in the sound of the vocal folds when the sustain starts being too weak. It depends on the style and what you have to do, how much sustain you must have under. So the question is, we have to develop the sustain. Why? Because a strong and long sustain will also make possible for us to do something in positioning the bridges in a different places for color and style purposes, and without straining the vocal folds. And doing that, we will, as I did in Italy with a pop singer with a very heavy voice, really interesting. She could sing some things from Nirvana and other repertoire like that. David Bowie, wow, quite amazing. And what I was doing with her, I was working on the sustain. She would have had the register passage in here, and we could have it, the sensation of the register of the passage, a little higher, just because we put the sustain well enough with that, so elastic that we were not straining her vocal folds, but we were working on the color of her voice. Of course, doing that, every time we do some kind of those things, and as I told in another talk, but I will repeat all the time, is that every time we work on a characteristic of the voice, we must take care not to put so much big that characteristic that it will eat all the others. Because it's like if a surface must remain basically the same. You can't use all that surface for one characteristic that you will have the disappearance of the others. And the others are the extension, the intensity, the elasticity, and also the volume, etc. So, no, basically those. I will have to think about, I will make a talk about that. So, talking about the sustain. When I find someone without sustain, I always work on the arpeggio and on the pronunciation. And that is the tricky thing. You don't have the sustain, you look for the sustain. Okay, but if the sustain can't be reached and the other conditions are not good enough, you will not be able to work on the sustain. That's why I wanted Alice Robin not to be so strict with what she wanted and not to want to understand immediately. Because this attitude of the brain will block the system how it is. So she will remain with the too much arpeggio that she thinks, and she will just try to push with that more. No, we create the condition in which that is also the muscle that reacts when we have fear, when we are uncertain, when we are stressed. What we did with the belcanto technique. We took control of the reaction, fight or flight of this muscle, that is the iliopsoas. And they did find that the sustain could work only by allowing that not to react all the time by fear. That's why very often when you are not in the second step, you think a certain kind of things, and in the second steps they are different. Because in the first step and before the first step, you are ruled, and if you are not ruled, you are yet in the second step, by this muscle and this force. And this force does react in a not technical way and not thought way to fear and to everything. And it is the one in which you are certain that you want to understand. You're the one that gives you the stiffness to define yourself by a changement. That it's normal. Absolutely. The question is that you must get elastic and not have your instrument to do gestures that have no sense for the singing. Even if in the first part they seem the most scary thing, it is just in the first part. It's just in the first part. And it is, you know, I made a professional school of theatre for 1 year, and they ask me sometimes, very often, to let me fall back. You know why? It is exactly the same muscle. You decide to do something absurd, just because so you learn to release this muscle. In vocal technique, we must learn to use and to release when it's required. That's why it's in the first step, a little confusing, but it's just a little discomfort, because we want to take the control over and to put the sustain.